James Brown's death was never just a sad ending. From the first announcement, it carried the faint smell of something deeply wrong. On December 25, 2006, the world was told the Godfather of Soul had died from illness. Congestive heart failure. Pneumonia. Natural causes. Case closed. But behind that neat hospital language, a darker version of the story started to move quietly through dressing rooms, tour buses, and old contacts in the soul and funk world. In those final days, James Brown wasn't only sick. He was cut off, watched, managed, and falling apart at a speed that shocked people who knew his body, his stubbornness, and the way he always fought back. According to long-standing rumors inside the industry, Vanessa Williams would later be mentioned, not as an accuser, but as someone who heard disturbing claims that a man close to Brown might have been slowly poisoning him under the cover of caretaking. Friends were turned away at doors. Access was routed through a narrowed chain. Medication, according to those whispers, was handled by a very small circle. Officially, no crime was ever proven. No charges, no poisoning listed on any official document. But if nothing criminal happened, why did his last months look less like care and more like containment? And who exactly stood to gain from James Brown weakening so fast, while decisions about his life and legacy tightened around him? Chapter 1: Sunrise Collapse and the Closed Circle, 2004-2006. Before anyone spoke about poison conspiracy or betrayal, something simpler and more unsettling appeared. James Brown was fading in plain sight. Not overnight. Not in one dramatic collapse. Slowly. Quietly. And by the time people realized how serious it had become, they couldn't get close enough to see for themselves. In 2004, James Brown was 71. Still on the road. Still hitting stages across South Carolina and Georgia. Still introduced as the hardest working man in show business. To the crowds he looked like he was outrunning time. But behind the curtains, the people who had watched him for years began to see hairline fractures. His breathing grew heavier faster after songs. He leaned on chairs and table edges backstage when he thought no one was watching. He slipped out of rooms early, cutting nights short. They were small details, but for a man whose entire legend was built on impossible stamina, they were jarring. The tour calendar stayed packed in 2004. His energy did not. Close friends later recalled how conversations shortened. The James Brown who used to dominate every discussion, now tired faster, waved people off more often. He still made choices, but increasingly through other voices. At first it looked like protection, like people helping him manage the load. Then slowly, it started to feel more like a filter. By 2005, access to James Brown changed in a way no one could ignore. Calls that once went straight to him now bounced back hours later if they were returned at all. Drop-in visits that used to be routine suddenly needed clearance. According to multiple acquaintances who later spoke to reporters and documentarians, the explanation rarely shifted. James is resting. He's not seeing anyone right now. Or worse, silence. That year, what had been a loose inner circle began to harden into a wall. Tommy Ray Heine, widely described as his partner, and later drawn into major legal battles over the estate, became a near constant presence. At the same time, advisor and attorney Charles Bobbitt took on more and more responsibility overseeing critical choices that reached into both James Brown's business and personal life. On stage Longtime, MC Danny Ray did what he had always done, kept the show moving, smoothed glitches, and made sure the audience never saw what was happening behind the performance. To ticket holders, the legend still looked untouchable. In private, that was no longer true. As 2005 went on, James Brown appeared in public less often. When he did, something felt off. His steps were more careful. His focus slipped. Some insiders said the fire was still there but dimmed. He seemed less combative, less commanding, more dependent on others to steer the moment. For a man famous for arguing with everyone, the new quiet felt wrong. Then 2006 arrived and everything sped up. From early in the year, James Brown's health began collapsing at a pace that stunned people who had seen him bounce back from previous crises. Hospital stays became more frequent. Details about each admission were kept tight, rarely shared beyond a small inner circle. Each time he was discharged, he seemed smaller, drained. People who caught even brief glimpses described a man worn down to the core, sometimes lucid, sometimes distant. What alarmed his old friends wasn't just that he was sick. It was how the information around his illness disappeared. Who was actually managing his medications, who signed off on treatment plans, who was allowed in the room when James Brown was too tired to argue for himself. Those questions started as quiet side comments. Then they shifted into urgent inquiries, then into raw frustration. Answers, when they came, were vague. Stories changed depending on who spoke. Some longtime associates say they were blocked completely. Others were told he doesn't want visitors, a statement they doubted based on decades of knowing him. One former collaborator, speaking later, put it simply: James never shut people out like that. Someone else was doing it. During this period, his world shrank. Home became the primary stage. Caretakers narrowed in number. Independence seeped away day by day. People who had traveled with him since the 1960s were forced to rely on rumors instead of direct contact. The man who once commanded every space he entered now seemed managed inside those same rooms. Emotionally, those near the situation described a shift that was harder to write down but impossible to ignore. James Brown seemed uneasy. Not exactly paranoid, just aware that choices were being made around him, above him, and sometimes in spite of him. He needed others for movement, for schedules, for basic care. The fierce control that had defined him was slipping. Medical files from that time exist, but they don't form a clean public roadmap. There's no widely accessible independent breakdown explaining why his decline happened so fast or in such a fragmented way. No external report that clearly matches symptoms to timeline. Instead, there's a gap. And in that blank space, concern, speculation, and rumor took root. Inside the soul and funk community, people started talking. Not in statements, but in low, careful sentences. They said he was fading too fast. They wondered aloud why they couldn't see him. According to long-circulating industry chatter, Vanessa Williams was among those who heard early warnings from insiders who had tried and failed to reach Brown. One phrase surfaced again and again in recollections: "Something is wrong." By late 2006, the isolation was almost complete. James Brown was still alive but unreachable. The public still saw a legend on posters and retrospectives. Those closest to him felt as if they were watching someone being quietly walled off. Control had replaced access. Explanations had been replaced by silence. On December 25, 2006, James Brown died. Officially congestive heart failure triggered by pneumonia. A natural death. File stamped. Case finished. But for the people who had watched the previous 2 years, from the first weak breaths on stage to the closed doors and unanswered calls, that explanation felt thin. Long before his heart stopped, something else had already disappeared: transparency. And once that was gone, the questions were never far behind. Chapter 2, Vanessa Williams and the Whispers no one wanted to write down. The warnings didn't arrive in police reports or public statements. They moved the way danger usually moves in the music business, quietly from mouth to ear, backstage to hallway, city to city. By late spring 2006, as James Brown's health seemed to be unraveling faster than anyone expected, the first uneasy conversations began circling among singers, promoters, and old road warriors. No one came forward with evidence. No one filed charges. What they carried instead were impressions, looks, gestures, fragments of behavior that didn't match the James Brown they knew. According to persistent behind-the-scenes accounts, Vanessa Williams became one of the people in the middle of this whisper trail. Not as someone pointing a finger, but as someone hearing the same unsettling story repeat itself from different mouths. The setting mattered. These weren't tidy interviews in well-lit studios. Most of these exchanges happened in liminal spaces backstage at benefit concerts, outside hotel ballrooms, down quiet side corridors, after televised events, or in tucked-away corners of industry parties in New York and Los Angeles. People who had recently crossed paths with James Brown described him in the same way over and over. He looked thinner, slower, less anchored. He's weaker than he should be, some said. He's not the James I remember, said others. For a man whose medical history was no secret, the speed of the downturn felt wrong. By June 2006, the concern deepened. Insiders who had tried to visit James Brown in South Carolina reported being turned away without clear reason. One organizer said the message at the gate was cold and short. He's not seeing anybody. Phone calls that used to be answered personally were now routed through layers of intermediaries who offered almost nothing. No updates. No direct connection. No sense of when or if someone might be allowed in. It was around this time, according to rumors later recounted in documentaries and memoir-style interviews, that Vanessa Williams began hearing the same line from different sides of the industry map. He's getting worse too fast. What troubled people wasn't only the decline, it was the way the decline was handled. Artists who had shared stages with James Brown for decades couldn't get straight answers about his treatment. Who was overseeing his care day to day, who controlled his medication schedule? Why were friends who'd known him since the 60s suddenly kept at a distance? No one claimed to have a prescription list in their hand or access to his charts. What they had were patterns, doors, closing calls, blocked vague explanations that changed depending on who picked up the phone. By August 2006, the whispers had sharpened into something closer to alarm. A promoter who briefly saw Brown backstage at an event in Georgia later described the encounter in a way that stayed with those who heard it. The Godfather of Soul was sitting quietly in a chair, barely speaking, his gaze drifting, while others in the room answered questions on his behalf. The moment lasted only minutes, but the promoter walked away unsettled. He told colleagues later he looked medicated in a way I've never seen before. Again, no dosage, no drug name, no lab tests. Just a feeling that whatever James Brown was being given, it was changing him. This is where Vanessa Williams' name surfaces again and again in industry lore, not as a public accuser, but as a witness to the unease. According to people who claim to have been present, she did something simple but important. She didn't shrug it off. As those around her shared what they'd seen, she reportedly told others, pay attention. Don't just wave this away. James was strong. This doesn't make sense. Her role, as the story has been repeated, was not to build a case, but to refuse to ignore the pattern. The accounts remained unrecorded, never crystallized into sworn testimony. They lived as overlapping memories passed from one trusted voice to another. As the heavy air of autumn 2006 moved in, the anxiety focused on one-word: medication. People who claimed insight into Brown's care whispered about frequent prescription changes. They said there was confusion and disagreement over what he was taking, when, and why. Some wondered quietly if James Brown fully understood the drugs being handed to him. Others questioned why no independent, well-known medical specialist had publicly stepped forward to outline his treatment. No documents surfaced to answer those questions. The silence itself became part of the story. Emotionally, the narrative darkened. Those who glimpsed Brown during these months described a man who no longer walked into rooms and seized control. He seemed uneasy, then withdrawn, at times strangely compliant. For a figure whose career was built on confrontation resistance and command, this sudden passivity rang wrong in the ears of people who had fought with him and for him for decades. According to one long-circulating account, Brown privately told a colleague that he was tired of being told what to do, tired of being managed. The rumored date, October 2006. The quote has never been verified in official records, but it appears again and again in oral histories around his death, like a ghost sentence. Nobody can quite trace back to tape. In these same retellings, Vanessa Williams begins to step back emotionally, not out of indifference, but out of helplessness. She had no lab reports, no direct authority, no formal path to investigate. All she had were fragments of concern, and a growing feeling that James Brown was no longer steering his own ship. By December 2006, the mood among insiders had shifted from concern to dread. James Brown was hospitalized again. This time access was cut even tighter. Those who asked to see him were told to wait. Others were simply left without any response at all. When the news broke on December 25, 2006, that James Brown had died, the world reacted with shock. But in green rooms, tour vans, and old neighborhood bars, a different sentence circulated quietly among those who had been watching the build-up. We saw this coming and we still don't understand what we saw. There was no official scandal, no police raids, no criminal charges, no press conference pointing fingers at a suspect. On paper, everything was clean. But privately, a heavy conviction settled in among many who had tried and failed to get close to him in those months. Whatever happened to James Brown, near the end it happened where almost no one could see it. Vanessa Williams never stood in front of cameras to accuse anyone. She never held up documents, never publicly named a supposed poisoner. Her role in this story, as it has been told, is defined by listening and by warning, hearing the early whispers, questioning the official calm, and standing in the remembered chain of people who sensed a disaster unfolding behind locked doors. In the communities that built soul and funk, one question still hangs in the air, heavy and unresolved. If nothing was wrong, why did so many people feel that something was? That unanswered question, left to echo in studios, churches, and backstage corridors, became the foundation for everything that would follow. Chapter 3: Strange Symptoms Before the End. By November 2006, worry stopped being abstract. It wasn't just about missed phone calls or blocked visits anymore. It was written on James Brown's body. People who managed to get even a few minutes near him in those final weeks described the same unsettling picture, a man failing faster than anyone expected in ways that didn't fit neatly into a simple diagnosis. Fatigue came first. Not the kind of tired that follows a show. A heavy bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to pull him down mid-sentence. He would sit abruptly as if his legs no longer trusted the floor. Sometimes he was sharp, cracking a line, recognizing a face, giving a quick, focused response. Other times within the same hour, his eyes drifted, his words slowed, and his attention seemed to slide away from the room. Then came the confusion. In early December 2006, acquaintances who briefly saw him in Georgia later said he repeated questions, circled back to things he'd already asked, or looked uncertain about why certain people were there at all. This was James Brown, a man known for his iron memory and iron will. The artist who used to recall set lists, money totals and names from decades ago suddenly seemed to be losing his grip on who was in front of him. For those who had watched him command every rehearsal, every band meeting, that shift wasn't just sad. It was frightening. The mood changes were just as disquieting. James Brown's temperament had always been a storm, volatile, decisive, explosive. But now, insiders described something different. He seemed subdued, pulled inward, like someone whose fight was slowly leaking away. There were flashes of irritation, but they felt different, too less like the old bursts of anger, and more like a low, constant frustration wrapped in confusion. He looked, people said, like a man who knew something was wrong but couldn't name it. What disturbed many was the speed. In the span of a few weeks, James Brown went from fragile but functioning to visibly diminished. Weight slipped off his frame. His shoulders rounded. His walk changed slower, more cautious, as if he no longer trusted his balance. He had survived serious health scares before. He had a history of pushing his body to extremes, then clawing his way back. But this time the decline felt different. Faster, less structured, harder to explain. Around this period, those closest to his long career felt the alarm more sharply. Bobby Bird, his longtime friend and collaborator, was said to be deeply concerned. He had known Brown across decades, stages, and crises. According to people who later spoke about those months, Bob believed James was not himself, that the weakness he saw went beyond normal aging. Reverend Al Sharpton also visited James Brown during this window. After the singer's death, Sharpton described a man who was struggling not only physically but emotionally. He didn't talk about crime or poison, but he made it clear what he saw in those final days did not look like a peaceful glide into old age. It looked like someone overwhelmed. What made everything worse was what didn't exist. For a figure as famous as James Brown, there is no detailed public timeline of those last weeks. No day-by-day medical account explaining when the confusion began, when the fatigue worsened, when each new symptom appeared. Hospitalizations are acknowledged but not fully mapped. Medication lists are referenced but not laid out for outside eyes. Instead, there is a vacuum. People who were there fill it with memories, his slowed speech, his unfocused eyes, his sudden passivity. But without a clear medical record open to scrutiny, those memories float in the dark unanchored. In the second week of December 2006, Brown was reportedly hospitalized again. Those trying to check on him ran into the same wall: limited access, controlled updates, vague reassurances. Some were told he was getting better. Others heard nothing. The inconsistency became its own kind of evidence, a sign that no one outside the inner ring really knew what was happening. A few who briefly saw him during this hospitalization said he looked heavily medicated. His words were slower, his movements careful, almost cautious. He followed instructions more than he gave them. No one stepped forward with a lab report. No one named specific drugs. But the phrase repeated quietly. He didn't seem all there. Emotionally, accounts from this time share the same tone: unease. People remembered James Brown expressing discomfort, sometimes with words, sometimes with the kind of looks that said more than sentences. He seemed to know his body was betraying him. He seemed to understand on some level that the control he had defended his entire life was slipping out of his hands. One long-circulated story claims that around December 22, 2006, he told someone he trusted that he was tired in a way that sounded final, like a man sensing the end, even if no doctor had said the words. That date, like so much else, is unverified, but it has lingered in oral histories like a timestamp carved into memory. The striking thing is not what was written down, it's what wasn't. How did James Brown go from touring into his 70s to dead in a matter of weeks? Why is there no clear independent summary that explains his rapid collapse? Why do so many people who saw him near the end describe a feeling that what they witnessed didn't line up with the simple story of an elderly man caught by pneumonia? On December 23, 2006, he was reported to be suffering from severe pneumonia. 2 days later, in the early hours of December 25, he was gone. Officially, it was straightforward. Congestive heart failure. Pneumonia. A body finally worn down. Case closed. But for those who had watched the final weeks, the memory is different. It isn't of a slow, predictable fade. It's of a rapid unraveling marked by confusion, unusual passivity, locked doors, and unanswered questions. James Brown didn't die in the glare of a final concert or the chaos of a public incident. He slipped away behind closed doors. The people who saw the warning signs, friends, collaborators, visitors, were left afterwards, trying to connect their fragments of experience, comparing notes, wondering if together their memories formed a picture that should have been investigated and never was. In the end, there were no dramatic last speeches, no public showdown, no confession. Just a quiet acceleration toward an end that almost no one outside a very small circle was allowed to witness directly. And as the news cameras turned toward funeral stages and tribute specials, another set of questions started to surface, questions that had less to do with how James Brown died and more to do with who stood to gain once he was gone. Chapter 4. The Christmas Morning That Never Added Up. Christmas morning, December 25, 2006, began quietly in Atlanta. Outside, the city was wrapped in lights, families unwrapping gifts, music stations still playing Santa Claus Go Straight to the Ghetto in tribute. Inside James Brown's world, everything was already critical. According to official accounts later summarized by doctors and those present, his condition had worsened during the night. His breathing was rough, uneven, each inhale a fight. The man, once known for dancing non-stop across stages, could barely pull air into his lungs. Shortly after 3:00 a.m., emergency services were called. James Brown was rushed to Emory Crawford Long Hospital. By the time he arrived, he was already in serious distress. Medical staff moved quickly, oxygen monitoring emergency interventions. On paper, the response followed protocol. In the room, it was clear the situation was slipping. At 3:45 a.m., James Brown was pronounced dead. Within hours, the news left Atlanta and circled the world. Headlines took on a familiar shape: legendary, iconic, natural causes. Doctors stated the cause of death as congestive heart failure triggered by pneumonia. For the public, it sounded tragically simple: an aging body, a serious infection, a heart that could not fight anymore. But for those who had watched him deteriorate over weeks, the details of that morning raised questions almost immediately. First came the timeline. James Brown had been struggling for weeks in and out of hospitals in late 2006. Pneumonia in an elderly patient is dangerous, but medicine has aggressive tools for it, especially for someone with James Brown's resources. That led some close observers to ask quietly at first, why did it seem like the most intensive efforts began only at the very end? Why was the final emergency call coming on Christmas morning instead of a full-scale intervention days earlier, when the decline was already obvious? Then there was access. In the days before his death, several longtime associates later said they were unable to get near him at all. Media reports and interviews described visitation as heavily limited, information as tightly managed. Some people who had toured with him for years only learned how serious things were after he was gone. For a man of his stature, that level of isolation in his final hours struck many as unnatural. Legends usually leave surrounded by witnesses. James Brown seemed to be leaving in an echo chamber. The autopsy by the Fulton County medical examiner did not release dramatic headlines. There was no official statement of poison in his body. No declaration of criminal involvement. The findings matched the hospital narrative: pneumonia and heart failure in a man with serious underlying health issues. Toxicology results, however, were never laid out in full public detail. The absence of clear, accessible data did not prove anything sinister, but it did leave space where suspicion could grow. What was missing was not a shocking new cause of death. It was context. The report did not explain the strange speed of his collapse. It did not map his final days hour by hour. It did not clarify